Hello, and welcome to the 63rd episode of a NEOHUMAN podcast. I'm Agha Bahari, adagologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow this show on liveinlimbo.com, YouTube, iTunes, BitChute, and a bunch of other places. And I have the pleasure to have Gennady Stolyarov II. I hope that I didn't butcher your name. It's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to NEOHUMAN podcast.
Thank you, Agha. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Absolutely. I've been following your work, some of your thoughts, some of your posts on social media, especially on Facebook, which, it's a reminder for me that social media is just like, our regular human environment, that we can choose who we associate with. And a lot of good ideas are being discussed in a variety of social media. So it's a pleasure to have you. Let's start with your background, the works you've done, lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Certainly. So as you mentioned, my name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I am currently the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party. I have been the chairman since November 2016. And I'm also the author of this book, Death is Wrong, which was published in 2013. It was and still remains the only illustrated children's book on indefinite life extension. In 2014, I arranged for a crowdfunding campaign to distribute over 1,000 copies of this book free of charge to children worldwide, and this book has been translated into 5 languages. It is available for free download online as well. So in my day job, I'm an actuary. An actuary is an insurance mathematician, a person who studies risk, a person who evaluates the impact of risk on various common areas of human endeavor. But for me, the overarching pursuit of my life, the reason why I do the work that I do, is the desire to overcome biological aging and death. This is something that has driven me ever since I found out about death as a young child, as I explain in Death is Wrong, and I instantly experienced a revulsion toward it. I saw it as a great injustice that people who had done nothing wrong would essentially receive the death penalty. And I also saw it as a great tragedy that everything in our lives, everything in our experiences, our thoughts, our memories would just be gone one day. So this to me is an intolerable situation, and I believe we are now on the cusp with the emerging technologies that are increasingly becoming available of overcoming this problem within our lifetimes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I ordered your book for my girlfriend's, then I think she was 9, for Christmas, and you were kind enough to write a note on the first page of it as well. I think it's a really, really interesting, and at the same time, I'm sure you would agree that it is a controversial kind of an approach in the context of human civilization and human history, because death has been accepted as an inevitable, death has been accepted as some kind of an ultimate equalizer, and it certainly has its place in spiritual practices, but I just don't see any kind of a conflict between, and it's interesting we're talking about this because the entire month of February, the concept of death was on my mind. It just came, and I thought this must be midlife crisis. It was something that I had to go through with it, and I see no conflict with using it for spiritual growth, and at the same time realize that our technological advancement, our scientific advancement are helping us to overcoming this medical condition. It is not an inevitable thing that is going to happen. That's why people are dying at different rates and different stages. Would you expand a little on that how the book and this approach of yours and transhumanist, that we're going to talk about transhumanism, has been received by the general public in general and the religious aspect of general public in specific?
Well, yes, there are many issues I could address here. But first of all, I will say probably the most shocking and controversial aspect of Death is Wrong is the cover images.
Right.
Read through the book. It's actually a fairly gentle narrative. Some of my personal history about how I found out about death and my own intellectual development and the kinds of arguments that I encountered, the kinds of rationalizations for death that I encountered. And I will say, in a broader cultural context, these rationalizations for death are understandable because during the vast majority of human existence, death truly was inevitable. If you were a hunter-gatherer, you would be lucky to survive to age 30. Likewise, if you were a peasant in the Middle Ages, if you were somebody who was born in the early 20th century, you might live to 90, but then again, you would be more likely to live to age 60. And throughout that vast span of human history, people somehow had to find ways to deal with that and nonetheless move on with their lives, do something productive with their lives, hopefully, and have some motivation to even continue the human species and procreate and know nonetheless that death would be coming for them and perhaps their children and their grandchildren. So various myths or explanations developed. Many of them are indeed religious, the idea of an afterlife or the idea of reincarnation. Others are more secular. I've had, I would say, about an equally accepting as well as equally skeptical response from religious individuals as well as atheists. So it doesn't really break down neatly along religious versus non-religious lines. There are some non-religious rationalizations for death as well, like, oh, it's just natural, or we come from stardust and we will return to stardust, or it's the circle of life, or it's selfish to want to live forever and let's free up room for other people. I, of course, disagree with all of those arguments. But on the other hand, there are religious transhumanists out there too. There is a Mormon Transhumanist Association. There's a Christian Transhumanist Association. And it's a matter of how people interpret their religions. After all, a lot of the basis for religion historically has been the pursuit of immortality. It's just that in prior eras, the means toward doing so were not technological, and in my view, they were not particularly efficacious. But someone could take the same theological beliefs and reinterpret them to really be compatible with the pursuit of technological life extension in this world. So I would say, in terms of the reception of my book, the main distinguishing feature is what I would call openness to a different future versus status quo bias. A lot of people, unfortunately, are affected with this status quo bias, and this is also an ingrained evolutionary flaw. Over the course of much of human history, change was very slow in terms of the background experiences of life. For most of human history, if you lived a certain way, it was likely your great-great-grandparents lived that way and your great-great-grandchildren would live that way. Only recently has progress become so noticeable that even looking back 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, we can point out many ways in which life was very different then. But culture, of course, lags behind technology, and religion especially lags behind both culture and technology. So I would say if there is a kind of religious conservatism, for lack of a better term, more of a kind of change aversion than, say, political conservatism, it's due to the fact that religion is a lagging indicator. So many religious beliefs and practices are kind of in an era which could properly be described as 30 or 40 years ago, whenever we happen to be alive. So religions today may be responding to the reality of the 1970s or the 1980s. And eventually, they will move forward as well. As I like to say, religions evolve. So the Christianity of today is very different from the Christianity of the 3rd century or the Renaissance or the 18th century. And this will continue to be the case. I don't think religion will go away. I think religions will transform themselves, and I hope that religions will transform themselves in a way that is more responsive to technological change and more open and tolerant of pursuits to enhance the human condition in this world.
Yeah, the whole concept of monotheistic religion seems to be like a ultimate bureaucracy. That you go through this process of change, and you will never hear back from the top of the chain. And so, you just have to deal with it. The boss might be wrong, but the boss is always the boss. That's the kind of an approach, which is very interesting to me when conservatives are talking about, hey, we don't want all of our options and all of the aspects of our lives being controlled by the government, yet they're perfectly fine with all of their aspect of life being controlled by another form of centralized structure of authoritarian religion.
Yes, indeed. And I do find that there is, within this way of thinking, a kind of inability to extricate oneself from centralized control. Now, as you may know, I am an atheist and I have been a lifelong atheist, but I've spent a lot of time around religious conservatives and I've debated with them. I've engaged in lengthy conversations with them. And a lot of them have trouble accepting the idea that there could be any sort of order or morality or even natural law without a lawgiver, without some anthropomorphic entity setting the rules. And of course, with the scientific understanding of the world, especially since the 18th century Age of Enlightenment, and especially since the explication of the concept of spontaneous order, where a certain regularity can emerge even though the constituent components had no part in designing it. They are just following certain patterns of behavior or certain rules. That idea is foreign to many of these individuals. I think in some ways they are stuck in a kind of pre-modern way of thinking, very hierarchical, very top-down. You need central authority to lay down the rules. And really the alternative to that is the modernist or transmodernist view, which states that you can have order without somebody imposing the order. You just have to understand how reality works.
Mm-hmm. You talked about change being noticeable in our life. Do you see that also as the consequence of exponential rate of growth in technology? Because to me, we have evolved with technology. We are not separated from our technology. We started, it's like the beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey. We had a tool, we used it, our opponents saw it and were like, oh, I can use it. They made it a little better, and then we made it a little better, and so on and so forth. Do you see it like that too?
Yes, well, there are certainly many areas of technology now which have this exponential pattern of growth, the most famous of which is Moore's Law, the doubling of processing power every 2 years originally, according to Gordon Moore. Since then, it's become about 18 months. But this has been applicable to other areas as well. Genome sequencing, for instance, the Human Genome Project in the 1990s cost many billions of dollars, and now it's possible to get one's genome sequenced for a few $100s, and that cost is still in decline. And of course, we have advances in artificial intelligence and algorithms that can parse a lot of the data that are being generated about our world. We have advances in automation. We have advances in robotics. And we also are beginning to get an acceleration of advances in more of the physical infrastructure of our lives. That's an area which has been lagging a bit. There was a boom in the mid-20th century, but since about the 1970s, 1980s, the creation of large infrastructure projects kind of got bogged down in bureaucracy. But gradually over the past decade, we've had more competition entering the field. We've had more privatization. We've had more enterprises figuring out ways to cut costs. A great example of that is Elon Musk's SpaceX. SpaceX has greatly reduced the cost of launching a payload into orbit. So now it's realistic to talk about sending a rocket to Mars or sending a rocket to the moon. Another area of very promising advances is autonomous vehicles. Again, the ability of a vehicle to operate itself under many conditions actually existed for over a decade. But being able to mass produce that capability, to do it economically, that's still coming online. But I'm optimistic that in the 2020s, we're going to have more and more vehicles on the road with increasing levels of autonomy. And of course, Elon Musk's Tesla has been at the forefront of these developments.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important to understand the relationship between innovation and progress and competition, and how important it is for us to realize now that when certain aspects of the US society and US government consider China to be a competitor, Chinese, in many aspects, are way ahead because they are not bound by certain things like religion. So they're much freer to experiment with genetic engineering, for example. At the same time, their entire society is being ran on the basis of centralized authority. So it's not that everything is fine there and everything is bad here. It's just that there are balances that can be defined and understood on the basis of competition.
Yes, and it's interesting when you bring up China, I also see significant strengths and significant weaknesses. If you look at a lot of large Chinese cities, you see these splendid skyscrapers, great architectural marvels. You see these high-speed bullet trains that it would take decades to get through the various bureaucratic tangles in the United States to construct. But on the other hand, you also have vast portions of the population living in squalor and perhaps not being able to even have access to basic hygiene. You have a situation like this coronavirus in Wuhan, where while the Chinese government has a lot of power and it can implement very stringent quarantine measures, it still couldn't do what an advanced Western country could do to halt the spread of this disease. And so I think the advantage of a society along the Chinese model is there are actually people who are able to say, I want this kind of change, and I have the resources and I have the authority to implement it. In Western societies, it's a lot more difficult, especially since the 1970s. There has been developed a kind of intentional system where at both a national level and at more local levels, constraints have been devised to prevent any individual or group of people to from actually carrying out something ambitious. So as an example, let's say there's a developer, especially in a place like San Francisco, that wants to construct affordable housing because housing is expensive, there's demand for affordable housing. But there are so many zoning regulations. There are so many building code restrictions. And there are so many special interest groups that are opposed to all development and the way the permitting process works. If this developer wants to construct this affordable housing complex, he would have to go before the local board of supervisors, and the local board of supervisors is obligated to hear all of the interested parties, many of whom will have determined and, in my view, irrational opposition to new development. And as a result, even if he does get to construct what most people believe is necessary to have affordable housing, it may take years and there may be huge cost overruns. So I think if I were to improve one aspect of life in the United States, it would be to create a way for as many individuals as possible and as many businesses as possible to have unbounded areas in which they would be able to exercise autonomy. Now, obviously, I shouldn't be able to do something with your property without your consent and vice versa, but I should be able to do a lot with my property, and I should be able to acquire property and build on it. So if, for instance, there's a consortium of businesses that wants to buy land to construct a hyperloop, there are a few experimental developments like that in the United States already. They should be allowed to do that. If it's their property, if it's their land, if they have the resources, why not allow them to do that experiment? And if it works, others would emulate it. If it doesn't work, then others would try something else.
I think another very good example in this context is how Tim Draper, who I also had the pleasure of having on NEOHUMAN podcast, the 50th episode, he had the plan to split California into three and run each part on blockchain, basically. And he was required to collect, I believe, 800,000 signatures, which he collected even more than that. But he said that the Supreme Court of California, 6 people just threw it away. So we're not dealing necessarily with as you said, a very rational kind of a situation. We're dealing like throughout our human history with group of people who have hold on power, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, a lot of these barriers stand in the way of many creative initiatives. As the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, I've experienced firsthand the difficulty of getting onto the ballot because I've studied the ballot access laws of many states. And some of them are fairly modest, like in Colorado, you can pay a $1,000 fee and have 9 people agree to be electors for your candidate, and you'll get on the ballot. But in other states, say California, you're required to get hundreds of thousands of signatures just to get on the ballot. And the requirements vary dramatically from a few hundred signatures in some states to many tens or even hundreds of thousands in other states. And yes, these requirements are quite motivated by the desire of incumbents to stay in power and not face even nominal competition. The Republican and Democratic parties have certainly influenced these very stringent ballot access thresholds. And what's more, as you pointed out, even if somebody gathers the necessary petition signatures, it is likely that one of the 2 major parties will challenge them. An example of this is what happened with the Green Party in Nevada. The Green Party in Nevada enjoys quite a bit of support, but it doesn't have ballot access, even though during the last election cycle, the Green Party was able to obtain the necessary number of petition signatures per Nevada law. It's just the Democratic Party in the state of Nevada challenged the petitions and protracted the challenge for such a long time that when the ballots were printed, the challenge was still ongoing and the Green Party couldn't get on the ballot. So these kinds of machinations are very real. And I would say in the United States especially, removing the ability of special interests to obstruct endeavors that don't involve their property or their rights is essential to facilitate additional progress.
Totally agree. And for those of our audience who are wondering why, for example, we're talking about Green Party. This is not about Green Party or any other party or any specific group. It's about having a platform for everyone and all sides to be able to compete, so the best outcome can be revealed and people can choose from it, right?
Yes, absolutely. And as an example of that, I was one of the sponsors of an open debate that was held on March 4th of this year in Chicago. It was hosted by the Free and Equal Elections Foundation, and it involved 18 candidates from 8 different political parties, as well as an independent candidate. Not because I favor all of these political parties, obviously. I wouldn't be able to. The candidate I support is Ben Zion of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, who also participated in this debate. But I wanted to help contribute to the creation of a platform for all of these views to be expressed and for people to hear all of these positions and realize that they have choices, that they have options, that no matter what their political preferences, they have spokespeople out there. It's just the mainstream media, the Commission on Presidential Debates, the Democratic National Committee, the Republican National Committee, and all of their allied special interest groups have undertaken a decades-long effort to prevent these voices from being heard. So this debate was really important to get those views out into the open. And I was speaking with everyday people in everyday interactions, like, say, an Uber driver or a server at a restaurant. And I was surprised how many of them had no idea that there were more than 2 political parties, that they actually could vote for someone else, that sometimes these third-party candidates are able to get on ballots and they are able to offer people an option that may be closer to their views. But at the very least with these debates, this has raised awareness of the existence of these alternatives.
What is the current state of Transhumanist Party? I was speaking with Zoltan Isvan, and something he mentioned, Zoltan being the founder of the Transhumanist Party, and perhaps the most famous, best known transhumanist in the world because of all the work that he's done, and he's been incredibly active. But he had a little bit of concern about the unbalance that exists within the transhumanist community, that he was saying that it's basically has been taken over by the far left people who are coming from the far left socialist aspect or perspective, and they've infiltrated and taken over the transhumanist community in large. How do you see it?
Well, I certainly am not far left myself, and I'm the chairman of the Transhumanist Party. So perhaps Zoltan has
And
been
he was not. I'm sorry, he was not talking about the party. He was talking about transhumanist community in large.
right. And there are some transhumanists who would call themselves far left. Of course, the transhumanist movement as a whole is not as unitary as any individual organization might be. Anyone can really call themselves a transhumanist, but within the Transhumanist Party, we've tried to be a big tent. We've tried to be welcoming to people of all political persuasions as long as they support radical life extension, the use of emerging technologies, technological progress, rational and ethical discourse on these subjects. So for us, it matters less where one stands on the conventional political spectrum. It matters more how open one is to ideas for transforming the state of the world and reaching the new era of our civilization. So we have some people who identify as being more to the left of the conventional political spectrum, but that's certainly not everyone. There is a large number of libertarian transhumanists. There is a decent number of centrist transhumanists or apolitical transhumanists, and some even would lean Republican. And we don't have in the Transhumanist Party any sort of litmus test along these lines. Personally, I care more about the individual and how the individual conducts himself or herself, what the individual's daily demeanor would be and willingness to contribute to the movement. So there are some people on the left of the political spectrum with whom I get along really well because I believe they're sincere, I believe they're hardworking, I believe that they're willing to collaborate in an environment where not everyone shares their views, and they're willing to find a path forward. Because really in transhumanism, in getting to this next era of our civilization, the key is to find a way to transcend these partisan distinctions. So ideally, in a transhuman future, somebody who might have been far left in this era or far right or center would be able to get together and find common ground and cooperate productively. Now, not everyone can do that. And I think this is the grain of truth in what Zoltan is saying. There are some people who are very strident, who are very negative in how they express themselves. There are some people who, if they disagree with someone, they automatically demonize that person. And the mainstream political climate over the past 5 years has contributed greatly to this because there has been this polarization fueled by the mainstream media and by the political class. This polarization is useful to them for ratings. It's useful to them for business because then a political consultant can say to his or her client, well, if you want to get the votes of the pro-gun lobby or the pro-abortion lobby, you have to do this, this, and this. And the more they can pigeonhole people, the more they can associate people with these rigid and caricatured stereotypes, the easier it is for them to actually suggest an effective strategy to their clients. The more people act like individuals, the more they actually think about each issue, think about what their views are, and debate and discuss them honestly with others, including others of different perspectives, the more varied a set of views we're going to have. It's a kind of hyper-pluralism where it's very difficult to pigeonhole people. And that hyperpluralism, I would say, is one of the best defenses of a healthy and free society. So within the Transhumanist Party, We, of course, have an extensive set of platform planks that we stand for. We have held many votes of our members on these platform planks. So anyone can go to our website and look them up. We have 97 of them. We have the Transhumanist Bill of Rights as well, which is now on its third version. But I would say none of these are left wing or right wing or socialist or libertarian per se. There may be elements borrowed from each of these persuasions. But ultimately, I would say we are upwing. We are looking forward and upward. We are looking toward the future of humanity. So I hope that in that spirit, more and more people can coalesce from all walks of life. But at the same time, I realize humans are hobbled sometimes by these evolutionary impulses. And all of the trolls, all of the detractors, all of the toxic personalities, they are that way because they cannot overcome the suboptimalities that unfortunately evolution has bestowed upon them. At some point in human history, these may have been very vicious warriors, the kinds who would be setting up massacres of other tribes, or if they saw an opportunity, if they saw somebody else from another tribe with some berries or a catch from the hunt, they would ambush that person and take away their stuff. So these same personalities are the ones who are sniping at people online, the ones who are sabotaging reputations, the ones who are engaging in ad hominem attacks. It's this kind of aggressive strategy. It might have worked as a survival mechanism in the Paleolithic era, but now it's profoundly counterproductive. And I hope people realize that. I hope even in an era where we don't actually have the technology to directly alter the human mind, people can alter their own minds by thinking rationally and introspecting and persuading themselves that there are better ways to act.
Yeah, I think the main concern in talking about far left, libertarian, whatever it is, because I see technology surpassing all of them. But the concern is that when you have tens of millions of people who will vote for candidates right now, who will say, we're going to get rid of private insurance and no competition whatsoever, and it would be the federal government who will provide healthcare for all of you. Healthcare is a very good example, I think. So that kind of a perspective coming into the Transhumanist Party, which I believe will have significant amount of opportunity moving forward in this decade, that is a little concerning for certain people, that we will not only have that totalitarian, authoritarian kind of a perspective, it will be fueled and it will be upgraded basically by the use of the latest modes and methods of technology.
So I would say the transhumanist perspective on healthcare is very different in certain qualitative respects from what I would call the democratic socialist perspective on healthcare, for lack of a better term. So somebody like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders would advocate for what they call Medicare for all, abolishing private insurance, even sometimes going to the notion of single payer, but they don't bring technology into the picture. What I think technology can do is just dramatically lower costs. If you have competition, if you have innovation, if you have the FDA approval processes at the very least greatly streamlined, then you could have a situation where healthcare becomes so affordable, and even with cutting edge technologies, they become available very rapidly within years rather than decades, that essentially universal healthcare will become similar to universal access to food, which exists today in the Western world. Even homeless people have access to food. It's hard to starve in the United States. So I would say the goal of making healthcare available and affordable to everyone is quite a worthwhile goal. Of course, we want people to be free from disease. Of course, we want people to live longer and better. But there is a serious debate that goes on about how best to achieve that access. And some transhumanists fall more along the lines of the view that I've articulated, that if we remove restrictions, this will happen on its own in fairly short order. Others believe that there's more of a role for government. And that's fine as long as they are able to articulate a different vision than tax everybody at a higher rate and centrally plan the delivery of healthcare. So if, for instance, they can find an alternative source of funding, if they say, well, let's cut military spending, let's remove a lot of troops from other parts of the world, and we'll save money, and we can use that for healthcare. I would say that's a better option. The U.S. Transhumanist Party candidate, Yohanan Ben-Zayed, has proposed a federal land dividend that supplies a basic income to individuals, and quite a generous basic income. He has done the calculations. Essentially, there are hundreds of trillions of dollars of value locked in federally owned land. So instead of letting that essentially lay dormant, why not lease it out to private businesses, perhaps under certain stipulations, like they have to respect the land, they have to not pollute it, they have to be environmentally friendly. But if they generate revenues from that land, the payments that they make to the federal government will then be distributed to the citizenry, similar to Alaska's oil dividend that gives Alaska residents about $2,000 a year. So that's not socialism, I would say, because it's not centralizing all aspects of life. It's still allowing for private enterprise to generate these revenues, and it's still allowing for individuals to spend that money as they see fit, contrary to today's highly conditional welfare systems where everything is micro-regulated. So if you go into a welfare office today, you want unemployment assistance. First of all, you lose it if you get a job. So that's a disincentive from people actually finding work. But at the same time, you have to check in, you have to demonstrate that you're looking for work. If you're getting food stamps, obviously you have to spend it on food. You can't spend it on alcohol or drugs. And people might say, well, that's a good thing. It promotes accountability. But the problem with this approach is it also requires a lot of bureaucracy. It requires a lot of overhead. So actually more money is spent on the overhead than is spent on the benefits to the recipients. If one can eliminate these programs and replace them with just a straightforward universal basic income, hopefully funded by sources like federal land dividend or savings in other areas of government spending, then this would be a more streamlined system, a more efficient system, a less socialist system if one is referring to the command and control aspects of socialism.
So this federal land dividend, which I believe Zoltan also introduced it when he ran as a Transhumanist Party candidate, is this the Transhumanist Party's way and method of providing UBI at this point?
Yes, it is. And the UBI that Ben-Zayed advocates, clearly individual calculations and estimates can differ, could be as high as $52,000 a year if all this federal land were leased and utilized in a manner that maximizes the revenues to the leasing businesses. But I would say it could start smaller as well. If some land is leased, for instance, and some revenue is generated, a computer could calculate, well, given this amount of U.S. citizen population and this amount of revenue from these businesses, if you divide it evenly among the population, how much would each person get? So I would say a universal basic income is a very promising step forward. And furthermore, it can be done in pieces. There are communities already that are experimenting with UBI. There are private initiatives that have been experimenting with UBI. Andrew Yang, as an example, during his campaign, wanted to give a universal basic income to a few families. And now that he has suspended his campaign, he is actually starting a private organization that will essentially continue his efforts along these lines.
Let me share with you my thought about UBI, because I see UBI as an inevitability. I've been called a socialist and all that for it, and I made the argument that this is not this is not a left or right kind of an argument. There are libertarians who are in favor of UBI. My idea is, why can't users receive directly from tech companies on the basis of their data contribution? Because obviously tech companies are making money out of user data, but users getting nothing in return.
Yes, this is a very astute observation, and I too have often spoken about the necessity to have a property right in one's own personal information. So whatever data exists about you, you have the right to decide what to do with it, to share it with the public or not to share it, or to share it under certain conditions. And the problem with a lot of social media sites today is that the conditions are not transparent at all. So if you make a post to Facebook, you don't know with what third parties that information will be shared necessarily. But if you can pick and choose, if Facebook could tell you, well, yes, we'll give you a platform to put your personal information on it. Now, we also have these third parties that may be interested in it. If you agree to share it with these third parties, you will get a certain payment, and the payment may be graduated depending on the extent to which you agree to share it. But then people can consciously evaluate the trade-offs of doing that, and they would receive a tangible benefit if they do decide to share their information. So I would say that would be a major step forward, and I would advocate for it.
Okay, and it also will be decentralized, meaning that you're not dependent on any kind of centralized payer, whether it's government or a company or anything like that. You get money from Facebook, you get money from Amazon, you get money from Apple, and then those companies start having a true and transparent competition that who can pay more for the user data, and very wonderful things can happen as a consequence of it, it seems like.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. We talked about how some religions are more flexible in order to adapt transhumanism moving forward. Mormonism is a very, very good example. I want to extend that to constitutions and building blocks of countries, some of them more susceptible to change based on the latest innovation and technological advancement. How do you see the ability of the U.S. Constitution moving forward with respect to technological and scientific advancements?
Well, the U.S. Constitution originally was intended as a framework for checks and balances in government, and it was intended via the Bill of Rights to provide some basic protections for individuals against an intrusive government, or a government that would restrict their prerogatives. So with that original interpretation of the Constitution, I see it as fully compatible with technological progress, because if people have the rights to essentially be sovereign in their own spheres of life, that's a benefit for technological progress. The problem arises whenever a society becomes too gridlocked. So over time, there emerge special interests that find little loopholes, find ways to reinterpret something, find ways to, let's say, lock in an advantageous position. And they may use constitutional arguments to do that, or they may use other means to do that. A lot of how the American political system works today has no mention in the Constitution. For instance, the Constitution has no mention of political parties. The Constitution has no mention of ballot access thresholds in any jurisdiction. The Constitution has no mention of thresholds for inclusion in debates, or any idea that, Iowa has to hold the first caucus in the nation. All of that is extra constitutional and has been developed through essentially tradition and special interest influence. And that is what is bogging down American society. The Constitution is very difficult to amend, and the framers deliberately made it so because they didn't want a political revolution every single generation. Now, does that, let's say, help us in our present day and age? We could be fine with it if we find other mechanisms to dislodge this special interest influence. But I wouldn't be averse to pursuing a constitutional amendment that would establish greater rights of political participation. If there were a constitutional amendment prohibiting ballot access thresholds in various states so that nobody is required to petition to be included on the ballot, or a constitutional amendment that would prevent private organizations, private political parties, from restricting who participates in a presidential debate. Those would be good ideas. The problem is it's hard. It's really hard to amend the Constitution. So I don't think that would be the first step. I think the first step would be to chip away at these special interest measures more on a state by state level, as well as in terms of public relations, in terms of setting up alternatives outside of the current political infrastructure and drawing as many people to them as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. The role of the society is huge. And I mean, it should come as a no-brainer that any technology works as well as a society that adopts it. And that is actually something that I'm very interested to know your opinion about, because less than 10 years ago, when Google Glass came out, videos emerged how people wearing them in restaurants and bars were being attacked by other people, or tech companies, buses taking their employees to their company were being stopped and attacked in San Francisco area. How well do you think we are doing as a society here, not only in the US, but in the West? I usually use Japan as an example of how organically they have adopted a lot of technological solutions. How well do you think we're doing in the West adopting to these latest technological and scientific innovations and advancements?
Unfortunately, I think Western societies aren't doing nearly as well as they could be. And the Google Glass example is quite a telling one. I think Google made a mistake there in making it kind of an exclusive trial where people couldn't even buy the Google Glass. They had to kind of lease it, and not everyone could have access to the trial. So essentially, people who saw someone wearing Google Glass at a restaurant or a coffee shop, they would think, well, this isn't me. This isn't something I could be. So these people, they're in a position of privilege and they're lording it over me. And I think that's what generated the hostile reaction. If you could go to a store right away and purchase Google Glass, I don't think that reaction would exist. I think Google made an enormous mistake by making it a closed trial instead of just releasing the product out on the market. And I think this is very important with regard to people's perceptions of technology. If people believe that this technology is at least potentially, eventually, going to be accessible to all, then they're going to be more receptive to it. But before that happens, because obviously not everyone can afford a new technology right away, it's very important to essentially advance the narrative, the true narrative, that this is not just the preserve for an elite few. And of course, with life extension, there is so much talk in Western societies about how this is just going to be for the wealthy, that only a small segment of the population is going to be able to afford it. And the fact is, many technologies start out that way, but they don't remain that way for long because there are many iterations of progress. And as long as there's the freedom to innovate, businesses and entrepreneurs are going to seek ways to expand their clientele, which means mass producing these products or services, which means making them more affordable and eliminating a lot of the flaws, the suboptimalities that exist in the first generation of any technology.
Yeah, which goes back to having a competition.
Right, exactly. because in the United States, unfortunately, there are situations where a given company can get exclusive rights
Mhm.
even over generic substance like insulin or the EpiPen, which delivers epinephrine, or Daraprim, which was a drug for a rare disorder, which Martin Shkreli raised the price of by 7,000%. And if there were competition for the manufacture of these devices, these enormous price increases would not have taken place. So competition is very important, but also societal attitudes are very important. It's necessary to cultivate an expectation that, yes, these will eventually become available to all and sooner than most people think. So Ray Kurzweil has a record for making predictions about where our technological abilities will be at various points in this century. And he himself has recently remarked that in terms of technical capability, his predictions have been close to on target. But in terms of societal acceptance, societal adoption
Yep.
of these technologies, we are farther behind than he expected us to be. So the societal factor is crucial. And that's why we can't just rely on the technical progress on its own to get us to the world where we need to be. We need to advocate for that world. We need to advocate for a change in attitudes and get people to see that a significantly better future is possible.
Absolutely. I totally agree. The other side of the equation, I have maybe 2 or 3 more questions for you if you have time.
Certainly.
Yeah, awesome. One of the concepts that I often think about is considering the further digitization of more and more aspects of our lives and the radical changes that are coming, whether it's 5G, more mainstream machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, Internet of Things. To me, the concept of having an individual as the president of the United States does not make any sense whatsoever. So my argument is that idealistically, in my world, Donald Trump would be the last human and the first AI president of the United States, considering the amount of data that exists of him, private and public. And he's been the president of the United States. If he's reelected in 2020, he will have 4 more years to develop this, at first perhaps exoskeleton AI that he can use side by side to, and then it can take over. How far are we? Well, first of all, what do you think about that concept of having an AI president, and how far do you think we are as a society to accept something like that?
Well, I hope that the AI president doesn't have Trump's personality flaws and emotional tendencies.
Now,
But
this is really interesting what you're mentioning, because this is exactly what I've heard at the very first thing, though. Who wants to have a Trump AI? But that would be the beginning point. The whole point is having this system of analyzing, interpreting, and making sense out of the data that will be given to that system, and the system will grow according to all the changes that is needed to be made, and flexible to the level, to the superhuman level, that we are not able to be that flexible to move according to the changes.
uh, well, I would say, in my view, the president has way too much power today
Yeah.
in the United States. The whole idea that somebody could press a red button and essentially obliterate human life on Earth is unacceptable for anyone to have that power, whether they're the most benevolent, prudent, far thinking individual or not, as could be argued with regard to our current president. Still, it is far too dangerous to entrust anyone with that kind of power. So I definitely support a kind of devolution of power from the president to other offices, other branches of government. The more checks and balances exist against that kind of use of authority, the better. Now, could artificial intelligence be involved in that? Yes, possibly in the future. Now, right now, we are still in the era of narrow artificial intelligence. So these are not algorithms that can jump across domains. They could be very good at specific functions like playing the game of Go or the game of chess or driving a car or piloting an aircraft. So today, if we were to incorporate artificial intelligence into decision making, these would be like experts, experts in particular areas of government function, maybe logistical AIs. If you have troops deployed abroad, these AIs would be able to give you the ideal supply chain so that you can save money, you can get the supplies to where you need them to go. And also, you could have algorithms that can protect lives on the battlefield. For instance, improved targeting systems or improved detection systems. If an algorithm could tell you where, say, guerrilla fighters are located or likely to be located in an area. So I support the use of AI systems where they can improve the outcome. But it's very important for now to still have a human being to be able to override the decisions of the AI algorithms. And the reason for that is we don't yet have sentient artificial general intelligence. We don't yet have systems that factor in all of this multifaceted array of human experiences and moral considerations that are required to make a judgment. So, for instance, let's say there's a false alarm and a bunch of US radar systems and other intelligence systems detect an ostensible launch of nuclear missiles from Russia toward the United States. And it's a false alarm, but all of these systems have been either deceived in some way or their design flaws led them to register these false attacks. This has happened multiple times throughout history on both the US side and the Soviet Union side back when there was a Soviet Union. So right now, there is a kind of check, even with someone like Donald Trump, because Donald Trump doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to lose access to his fortune, his many properties, his path to continued prosperity. So he might look at this and kind of second guess the results and say, is it really worth it to press that red button?
Also, it's not good for property value.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So one could actually expect the more selfish side of Donald Trump, the side that just wants to enjoy life, to second guess what all of these systems are telling you. But if an artificially intelligent algorithm sees that the preponderance of evidence is in support of a retaliatory strike, maybe the decision might be made in a more mechanistic fashion, because again, these algorithms, they don't take into account all these moral considerations yet. For that, we would need about 20 to 30 years of additional progress. Now, if you have an artificial general intelligence that can persuade us that it is sentient and moreover carry out the functions of sentient entities, not just including learning, but moral deliberation, moral reasoning, then we may have a role for that kind of entity to make political decisions. Now, at that point, of course, we have to discuss rights. And this is what the Transhumanist Bill of Rights endeavors to anticipate, so that instead of just starting this conversation 20 or 30 years from now, we will have laid the groundwork for it and hopefully avert a lot of civil rights conflicts that may otherwise occur.
Yeah, the alignment problem remains the most challenging aspect of artificial intelligence. And because of that, it just seems to me that we're not talking about it nearly enough. And it was very telling to me when John Delaney, who was running as a Democrat, and this is the man who started AI caucus in Congress, and he didn't mention a single time about artificial intelligence, which suggests to me that the voter base are not familiar or even care about the issue. That's why these people are not talking about it.
Yes, well, I think a lot of people, again, have this status quo bias. So they see what these algorithms can do today, and these are fascinating capabilities. I hope people are keeping themselves abreast of what these algorithms can do. They also see the limitations, and they also think that perhaps this is 20 or 30 years away, and they put it out of their minds. And I would say it's important to gradually, methodically, and very conscientiously lay the framework of what that future society would look like, where there is greater integration of AI into our lives, into decisions that are made. What would that world look like? What benefits could stem from it if we have a more rapid rate of technological advancement? If we can solve a lot of the age old problems of the human condition, it may well be worth it. But we have to approach it using rationality and ethics every step of the way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You mentioned Ben Zion. Is he the ultimate nominee of the Transhumanist Party at this point for 2020?
Yes, he is. He
Okay.
won our electronic primary, which was held in late September, and he has been campaigning ever since. We're very pleased with the outreach that he has been doing, both within the transhumanist community and outside it. The March 4th open debate in Chicago was a great example of that. And we are, as we speak, working on setting up other virtual debates in the future. So perhaps there will be one this weekend.
Yeah, it's really interesting how Transhumanist Party has the opportunity, like exactly what you said, and this quote by Buckminster Fuller that to change a system. Now this is what I can remember of it. To change a system, it's pointless to fight that system. You create an alternative that make the existing model obsolete. It seems like a very unique kind of an opportunity for the Transhumanist Party, not being distracted by all the noise that is happening in this very chaotic so-called conventional political system here in the U.S.
Yes, indeed. And this is exactly what we seek to do. I'm familiar with the quotation from Buckminster Fuller that you mentioned, and that is precisely our modus operandi. So I believe this mainstream political system is in the process of committing suicide.
Yep.
Both parties are just undermining themselves with all of the toxicity, all of the negativity, all of the ways in which they are alienating human beings. And greater segments of the American electorate are frankly fed up with this. So they're going to seek an alternative. Eventually, when one or both of these political parties implode, there will be a vacuum. So what will step into that vacuum? And that is not a foreordained conclusion. Sometimes in these tumultuous epochs of human history, something worse can step into the vacuum. For instance, in Weimar Germany, where out of the chaos emerged Hitler. But we want to prepare for something better to step into the vacuum, a more humane, a more techno-optimistic way of looking at the world and looking at policy and shaping the political landscape to be truly representative and to be truly focused on human well-being. So that is what I hope the U.S. Transhumanist Party will accomplish. Now, it's not necessarily an easy road either, in the sense that we are still a fairly small organization with limited resources, but we are growing. We are reaching more people. We have about 2,200 members now. And when I started, it was 3 members. So this trajectory over the past several years has been encouraging. We just need to find ways to spread these ideas to broader demographics and accelerate our growth.
Yeah, I think you've been doing a fantastic job as the chairman of the Transhumanist Party. How many Transhumanist parties are around the world, and are you in contact with them as the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party?
Well, there are a few transhumanist parties around the world in various stages of development. There's a Transhumanist Party UK in the United Kingdom, and that has been run by David Wood as well as some of his associates for a few years, since 2015, I believe. And we are in occasional contact with them. There is a younger Transhumanist Party of Canada where they are essentially trying to broaden their membership. They have, I believe, a few hundred members at this stage.
Who's running that?
I believe there are 2 people right now who are primarily involved in that. One is Arya Cheng, and the other is Dr. Jeremy Owen Turner.
Okay.
And then there is, in Germany, there had been a kind of transhuman party there, but my impression is it's more dormant. There is a party for health research in Germany, which has had a lot of success getting on the ballots and getting a robust number of votes in elections for the German parliament. So thousands of votes in certain areas. So that's quite promising. And I've met a few of their representatives at various conferences in the United States. But I would say those are the three major transhumanist focused parties outside of the United States. And then there are occasional initiatives by candidates to run. So Jose Cordero in Spain ran for parliament, and his party, it was, the Spanish acronym is MIEL. It is the Independent Movement of European Latin American individuals. So he kind of combined advocacy for longevity with advocacy for Latin American immigrants to places like Spain. And he also got about, I think, 7,000, a few more than that, votes in the Spanish parliamentary elections. So I am supportive of all of these efforts. I believe the more variety there is in these political pursuits, the better. The more ways people attempt to spread the transhumanist message, the greater the likelihood that it will reach additional demographics.
Mm-hmm. Did you listen to Aubrey de Grey on Joe Rogan, this latest episode?
Yes, I did.
Well, the part that he's talking about how the change is going to happen in 5 to 7 years, and it's basically coming overnight, because the point that he's making that is very, very sensible is that the moment you give people the very practical option that they will be able to live for much longer, their expectation is going to change overnight, and it will change everything with it, going back to the society and how it will reflect the way that society adapts into the latest scientific and technological advancements. So to me, 2020s seems like a game changer for transhumanism, for life extension parties, and even like pirate party. Parties that are dealing with technology as a primary element of basically everything else that follows.
Yes, and this could very well be the case. I think it would help if some records are broken. So if we get a human being living to 123 and surpassing Jean Calment's longevity record, that is going to turn heads. And likewise, if we continue to get significant life extension in higher order animals, that's also going to turn heads. And I do believe still animal life extension is going to come sooner than human life extension because there are fewer experimental barriers. But people actually have to conduct experiments that don't just look at reversal of health conditions, but actually keep these animals alive for as long as they're capable of living. Because a lot of these interventions, a lot of the trials have just looked at, well, have they cured this cancer? Have they reversed symptoms of heart damage in these mice? But really, it's important, I think, to just keep the mice around for longer than the experimental time frame to see how long they ultimately get to live. So more of those experiments will help. It's a question of, can there be some dramatic breakthroughs that are very visible to the public that will lead to this essentially overnight opinion shift? I would welcome that. But in the meantime, I don't know if it's coming in 2023 or 2028. And I believe we need to just patiently, methodically continue to do the work in building up U.S. Transhumanist Party and other transhumanist organizations, in spreading these ideas and communicating to the general public so that whenever this happens, we are ready to utilize it to the best of our ability and essentially catapult our organizations and our platforms into the mainstream.
Totally agree. So what's next for you, and where can our audience follow your work, and what's happening with the U.S. Transhumanist Party?
Well, to follow the Transhumanist Party, go to transhumanist-party.org. That's transhumanist-party.org. You will see a link to sign up for free membership. I encourage you to do that, no matter what your other political persuasions are. Please also go to benzion2020.com. That is the campaign website of our endorsed candidate for the office of President of the United States. Ben Zion is going to be out touring and debating for many months. He is going to stay in the race all the way until November 2020. For me, go to my personal site, my online magazine, which I have now been publishing for 17 and a half years, The Rational Argumentator, rationalargumentator.com. You can also find me on YouTube. My YouTube channel is G. Stolyarov II. So I have videos there dating back from 2007. My subsequent plans as the chairman of the Transhumanist Party are to continue to oversee our growth, to help the Ben Zion campaign in any way that I can, to plan for events, to participate in discussions like this one, and essentially see how much outreach we can do. The more, the better. So anyone who wants to talk to me, anyone who wants to discuss these ideas, ask me questions, make suggestions, are quite welcome to do so.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Gennady, and I hope that maybe I can get Ben Zion come on the show and we have a discussion with him. I've been interested in transhumanism. I used to co-organize and run transhumanist meetups in Toronto since 2012 and stayed in it. And certainly, again, it seems like an inevitable kind of a change that is coming as a result of technological advancement and science. So it's always a pleasure speaking with some of the leaders of this movement. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement?
Well, I would say the worst thing humanity has done is essentially engage in casual cruelty throughout human history. The ease with which people in many eras and many societies have been willing to end the lives of their fellow humans for some petty gain. The greatest achievement of humankind, I would say, is the massive infrastructure of contemporary civilization. The world we live in, which is not the natural world, which is a world of our creation, which is a world that projects all of the beauty and creativity and intricacy of the human mind upon physical matter. So that world takes us farther and farther away from these destructive primeval impulses. And that's the world that we need to continue to build. So if I were to encounter an alien intelligence, I would say, well, I hope you can overlook the, let's say, ignominious origins of our species, all of the strife and cruelty and violence that marked the early age of man. And I hope that you can see that despite that, the human spirit and human rationality have created a set of systems that are able to lift us far beyond that and hopefully enable us to have fruitful cooperation with other forms of intelligent life as well.